David, for that very generous introduction. And let me thank the Society, too, for this kind invitation to speak to you this afternoon. Special thanks to Michael Hopkins for all of his thoughtful arrangements. And there are many friends here, and I'm deeply touched, many friends from whom I've learned so much over the years. In his presidential address to the Ecclesiastical History Society in 1970, W.R. Ward, Reg Ward, professor of modern history at the University of Durham, made a remarkable claim for the generation of 1790 to 1830. The generation about which I wish to speak, he asserted, was, I make no doubt, the most important single generation in the modern history, not merely of English religion, but of the whole Christian world. For there seems no doubt that the effectiveness of the church throughout Western Europe was undermined by the same forces which were everywhere sapping the Ancien regime, the whole institutional complex of which religious establishments were part. The great crisis of the French Revolution altered forever the terms on which religious establishments must work, and in so doing, it intensified everywhere a long-felt need for private action in the world of religion. Now, this was a bold claim, which many will question, perhaps not least in light of church decline in recent years. But there can be little doubt that these 40 years, as David was just saying, were of vital importance for Western politics, culture, and religion. This was the age of democratic revolutions, which experienced the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. The period witnessed early industrialization, with the associated social dislocations, including large-scale movements of population, extreme poverty for many, and the rapid growth of industrial towns. It saw the first successful slave rebellion in Haiti. It saw successful movements to end the slave trade and popular campaigns to end slavery. It also saw the British conquest of much of the Indian subcontinent, beginning a new era of Western imperialism. And in Britain, the period witnessed a remarkable growth of vital Christianity, including a massive expansion of religious dissent, new millenarian visions and prophetic voices, and an outpouring of Christian missionary and philanthropic activity. Now, the religious awakenings of 1790 to 1830 in Britain were part of a larger awakening movement that profoundly affected the whole Western world. There was the extraordinary recovery of the Catholic Church and Catholic popular devotion across Europe following the de-Christianization campaigns of the French Revolution and the efforts of the Napoleonic Empire to impose state control over the Catholic Church. There were major Protestant awakenings in Germany and Scandinavia associated with reaction to revolution and with national resistance to Napoleonic conquest. There was the Protestant revival movement known as the Second Great Awakening in North America. The awakening movements were profoundly influenced by the later religious Enlightenment and by Romanticism, with its emphasis on human feeling and personal autonomy. There were also millenarian visions across Europe. In 1965, the late John Walsh, we honor greatly, John explored these awakenings across the Western world, 1790 to 1830, in a brilliant chapter in the Cambridge Modern History. And in 2006, I attempted a similar chapter in the Cambridge History of Christianity. Over 40 years ago, as David mentioned, I wrote a biography of Thomas Chalmers, a key figure in this awakening movement. And the generation of 1790 to 1830 continues to intrigue me. Was this indeed the single most important generation in the modern history of the Christian world? Is there evidence for such a bold claim? And what I'd like to do this afternoon is to explore the question with particular reference to Britain. So first, the revival of vital religion. The outbreak in 1789 of the French Revolution, with its hopes for a new era of liberty and equality, and its assault on the established order of state and church in France, contributed to religious stirrings across Europe. For the generation that was overshadowed by the French Revolution, there was a sense that the world was entering a new dispensation. Traditional beliefs in a divinely ordained union of church and state, of throne and altar, came under unprecedented challenge, as did beliefs that divine authority flowed down from above through religious establishments and parish churches supported by the crown and the landed elite. In Britain, the 1790s saw a massive upsurge of a warm, personal, heartfelt, conversionist, Bible-centered Christianity, which had had its beginnings in the 1730s and 1740s, associated with the Wesleyan Methodist movement in England and Wales, the Cambuslang revival in Scotland. But the resurgence of in the 1790s seemed more spontaneous, popular, amorphous than the earlier revival movements. It took hold among people who were experiencing the social dislocations, unemployment, mass poverty associated with early industrialization, the enclosures of common lands, the rapid growth of industrial towns, and after 1793, the pressures of war with revolutionary France. Acute distress was one factor bringing many laboring people to look to religion for consolation and to view this world as a place of pilgrimage and preparation for eternity. There was an unprecedented increase in itinerant preaching, especially after 1795. The itinerants included Methodists, of course, and after about 1780, Baptists and Congregationalists. Some itinerant preachers were students for the ministry at dissenting academies. Some were supported by existing congregations, some by home mission associations, while some were just freelancers, relying on the hospitality of local people. While many itinerants had theological training, many were without ordination in any church. They were often poor, illiterate, or scarcely literate, and they preached in a simple, homely language in cottages, barns, or in the open fields. Their preaching took them to remote villages and hamlets, and also to the new factory villages, mining areas, and canal settlements that were emerging around the country. They were especially successful in the Northeast, the North Midlands, and Cornwall. These village preachers proclaimed an emotive message of human sin and depravity, of salvation by accepting Christ's atonement for sin on the cross, and of sanctification through the influence of the Holy Spirit. They were broadly Arminian or moderate Calvinist in their theology, placing emphasis, though, on free will and individual capacity to accept the gospel. And they were not much concerned with creedal statements or theological systems. And when the itinerant evangelists move on to the next village, the converts they left behind would often form themselves into congregations, which might meet in a cottage, a barn, or a rented room, with converts offering mutual support to one another, and lay people preaching until the next visit by an itinerant. And women, such as the Methodists Sarah Crosby, Elizabeth Ritchie, and Ann Cutler, proved to be powerful itinerant preachers, speaking to the concerns of families amid scarcity and rapid social change. They promoted what has been described as a cottage religion, with emphasis on the sanctity of the home, family piety, temperance, and respect for local customs. A majority of members of the growing Methodist societies, about 58% between 1759 and 1832, were women, while over 60% of Congregationalists and Baptists between 1801 and 1825 were women. In Scotland, the brothers James and Robert Haldane, landed gentlemen and former naval officer, supported a Scottish movement of itinerant preaching from about 1797, gaining large numbers of converts and establishing numerous independent and later Baptist congregations throughout Scotland, including the Highlands and the Islands. From about 1805, itinerant preachers associated with the Second Great Awakening arrived from the United States. They included Lorenzo Crazy Dow, with his patriarchal beard and his wild flashing eyes. They drew upon practices from the American Second Awakening, including camp meetings, in which large numbers would gather in the open air for prolonged revival meetings. The first English camp meeting was held in May 1807, with some 3,000 gathering at Malcott in North Staffordshire. This led in 1811 to the secession of the primitive Methodists, or the Ranters, when the Wesleyan Methodist leadership refused to countenance camp meetings. There were a growing number of local revivals, viewed as a special downpourings of the Holy Spirit, often accompanied by expressions of intense emotion, including prostrations and convulsions. Wales became the setting for a number of local revivals after 1807. Hymn singing was vital to the whole awakening movement. Many evangelical dissenters were drawn to the Sunday school movement, which began in the later 1780s to provide basic literacy and religious instruction to laboring children and young adults who had to work during the week. Supported by non-denominational voluntary associations, especially the Sunday School Society and the Sunday School Union, the Sunday schools were generally taught by unpaid volunteers, and a major aim was to enable laboring people to read the Bible for their conversion and their Christian growth. Sunday schools were closely linked to itinerant preaching. There was a significant growth of Sunday schools in England, with some 206,000 children enrolled by 1801 and 415,000 by 1811. The revival movement beginning in the 1790s contributed to an immense increase in Protestant dissent in Britain. It's difficult to quantify the numbers of new adherents because most did not become church members. But we can get an idea of the scale of growth in the numbers of new dissenting meeting places. Under the terms of the Toleration Act of 1689, all dissenting places of worship in England and Wales had to be registered. Between 1771 and 1780, 956 dissenting places of worship were registered. This rose to 5,434 registrations between 1801 and 1811, and then 10,138 registrations between 1811 and 1820. Many of the swelling numbers of dissenting adherents made a conscious decision to step out of the traditional community of life of the parish. With its parish church, its churchyard, the ancestors were buried, its historic associations, they chose to become dissenters. Others perhaps had known only neglect from the parish clergy of the established churches. Critics denounced the newly erected dissenting chapels for their coarseness and deformity, said, quote, they were plain, unsightly buildings, more like barns or warehouses than places of worship. And among the governing classes, many grew concerned over the itinerant preaching, the cottage religion, the Sunday schools. They viewed the growing numbers of dissenters as subversive of the proper order in church and state at a time of revolutionary fear. Alongside fears of radical reformers inspired by the French Revolution, there were fears that the new dissent represented a revival of 17th century Puritanism, including dreams of a commonwealth. Proposals were made in 1799 for parliamentary legislation to suppress itinerant preaching, but these proved abortive. In 1811, the former Tory Prime Minister, Viscount Sidmouth, introduced a bill to restrict itinerant preaching, but dissenters quickly organized a national movement of protest, including some 500 petitions sent to the House of Lords, and Sidmouth's bill failed. Instead, the government made concessions to the new strength of dissent, abolishing in 1812 two 17th century laws against dissenters, and passing a new Toleration Act in 1813. Some 15 years later, with the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts in 1828 and the passing of Catholic emancipation in 1829, Parliament effectively ended the traditional confessional state in Britain. In 1790, dissenters had represented about 10% of the British population. By 1815, dissenters represented about a third of the British population, probably more. And the number of active dissenters may have been equal or greater than the number of active adherents of the established churches. Phenomenal. There was also a significant religious awakening within the established churches of England and Scotland, associated with a group of wealthy, well-connected evangelicals, including William Wilberforce and Hannah More, who promoted the formation of voluntary philanthropic associations to reform religious and moral life. Voluntary associations. Combined with the activism of these voluntary associations, there were moves to reform the established churches in England and Scotland. These included new state grants for building additional parish churches, parliamentary acts to enhance the power of bishops to supervise the behavior of the parish clergy, including non-residence and pluralism, restricting non-residence and pluralism. There were internal church reform. There were internal church reform movements aimed at improving pastoral care, home mission, and educational provision within the parishes. The reforms were aimed at making the established churches more effective in providing religious observances and pastoral care and informing parish communities, rather than to seek to strengthen their authority as establishments. According to the Church of Scotland evangelical convert and leader, Thomas Chalmers, speaking in the 1830s, the reformers aimed to see the clergy of the established churches become, quote, tribunes of the people. And as Professor Ward observed, the great crisis of the French Revolution changed entirely the terms on which the established churches functioned. They could no longer be counted on to serve the interests of the state, to impose social control over populations, and promote public virtue from above. Religion throughout Britain was becoming increasingly voluntary in nature. The religious awakening movement was unleashing the new capacities of the common people for religious and moral action. It was about promoting human agency among the common people, rather than power from above. The evangelical congregational preacher David Bogue declared in a sermon in 1791 that this generation will not pass away before the expiring drones of arbitrary power are heard in every country of Europe. Millenarianism and Romanticism. The violence of the French Revolution, the revolution's assault on the established church in France, and then on Christianity more generally, and the success of the revolutionary French armies all served to intensify a sense of crisis and of radical discontinuity with the past. Amid the revolutionary upheavals and of the unprecedented assault on Christianity by the French revolutionaries, many in Britain turned to religious prophecy in seeking a deeper meaning behind the events. They saw the victories of the French armies, the French occupation of Rome and the seizure of the Pope by the Revolutionary Army in 1798, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the creation of the French Empire in 1804. These things were seen as signs and wonders, pointing to a new world dispensation. Some were drawn to 17th century visionary writings, including the imagery of a world turned upside down, or the antinomian rejections of the alliance of throne and altar. Some embraced millenarian visions, believing that the 1,000-year reign of the saints on earth, as prophesied in Scripture, was approaching. Most British millenarians were post-millennialists, who believed that the world would gradually progress into the millennium, after which Christ would return for the last glory. But by 1820, an increasing number were premillennialists, believing that the world was descending into chaos and that Christ would return in glory to end the turmoil and usher in the millennium. Such believers could see the revolutionary upheavals as signs and wonders that showed the faithful who had eyes to see that the world had entered its end time and that Christ's return was imminent. The faithful pored over the Scriptures for prophecies that would make sense of the dislocations and the upheavals. Some were drawn to the mystical writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish natural philosopher, theologian, and millenarian who had proclaimed that the millennium had already arrived. The Church of the New Jerusalem, inspired by Swedenborg's prophetical writings, was established in London in 1787 and spread to other English cities in the early 1790s. The English poet and illustrator William Blake was for a time drawn to the Swedenborgian belief in the coming of the New Jerusalem. And Blake's etchings, paintings, and verse, especially after 1790, reflected his belief in a divinity that now permeated all things, and the sense of a new spiritual era being born. Some visionaries proclaimed that the age of the Holy Spirit had begun. The English dissenting clergyman and natural philosopher, Joseph Priestley, came to believe that amid the unprecedented upheavals of the time, the second coming of Christ was imminent. In 1793, he declared in a sermon that what he described as the three great scriptural prophecies, the fall of the papacy, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and the restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land, were now being fulfilled. And in these final days, he proclaimed, we shall find extraordinary men unexpectedly rising up to act the most important parts, men who had never been heard of before. And in 1794, one such extraordinary man, Richard Brothers, a retired naval officer, proclaimed himself to be the nephew of God and king of the Hebrews, and insisted that it was only his direct appeal to God on the 3rd of August, 1793, that had spared the world from divine judgment in the form of total desolation. Brothers now promised to gather together all the Jews, including the hidden Jews, who had assimilated into Gentile society centuries earlier, and who he claimed actually formed a large proportion of the British population. He would lead these Jews, the hidden Jews, back to the Holy Land in preparation for the millennium. And while he wasn't a charismatic leader, his writings encouraged others to look to prophecy and apocalyptic visions. All the madmen and enthusiasts in England, observed the poet Robert Stolpe in 1807, made a common cause with this king of the Hebrews. One madman, Stolpe continued, printed his dreams, another his day visions. One had seen an angel come out of the sun with a sword drawn in his hand. Another had seen fiery dragons in the air and hosts of angels in battle array. These signs and tokens were represented in crude engravings, and the lower classes of people began to believe that the 7 seals were about to be opened and the wonders of the apocalypse would be displayed. Declared insane in 1795, Brothers was placed in a private asylum where he remained until 1806. By this time, a new prophetess, Joanna Southcott, a laboring woman from Devon, had emerged. She began conveying divine messages in 1792. She settled in London in 1802. Claiming to be the woman clothed in the sun, as described in Revelation 12, she insisted that she had been called by the Holy Spirit to seal believers in advance of the last judgment, which was fast approaching. By 1814, some 20,000 people, mainly from the London artisan classes, had received her seal. Southcott promised to give birth to Shiloh, a shadowy messianic figure, but she died in 1814 after a false pregnancy. Loyal followers convinced themselves that the birth of Shiloh had occurred in a spiritual sense, and they continued to adhere to her teachings, including the imminence of the millennium. The passion for prophecy spread through British society. Samuel Horsley, Church of England Bishop of Rochester, interpreted the French Revolution in apocalyptic terms, discerning, quote, the raging sea of anarchy and irreligion, discerning in the raging sea of anarchy and irreligion the dreadful apocalyptic beast. By 1806, Bishop Horsley was convinced that Napoleon would return the Jews to Palestine and proclaim himself the Messiah before being revealed as the Antichrist. Millenarian beliefs infused the work of Samuel Fry, a German Jewish convert who immigrated to London in 1801 and established the London Society for promoting Christianity among the Jews in 1809. The conversion of the Jews would presage the return of Christ in glory. Spencer Perceval, Prime Minister from 1809 to 1812, he was assassinated. He was an evangelical who looked to biblical prophecy to explain the great struggle with Napoleonic France. The Scottish evangelical Presbyterian preacher Edward Irving embraced prophecy and premillenarianism following his move to London, the London Church, in 1822. In 1826, he published Babylon and Infidelity, Foredoomed of God, drawing on scriptural prophecy to maintain that Britain had triumphed by then over the Napoleonic Antichrist because it was God's sealed or elect nation, and that Christ's return in glory was imminent. That same year, Henry Drummond, a wealthy Tory banker, landowner, began hosting annual conferences for the study of prophecy at his estate at Albury Park, and the Society for the Investigation of Prophecy was founded in London. Then, by 1831, there were cases of faith healing, telepathy, speaking in tongues in Western Scotland and in London. For believers, these spirit gifts were further signs of Christ's imminent return. During the 1820s, the English Romantic painter John Martin found inspiration in the prophetic movement for his apocalyptic canvases, including Balthasar's Feast and the Fall of Babylon. For many, witnessing the upheavals associated with the French and the Industrial Revolutions, then the prophetical and millenarian movements revealed a higher providence, directing these upheavals for a divine purpose. The world was advancing inexorably toward the millennium, and Christ's second coming seemed imminent. In the divine drama being played out through revolution and war, some viewed Britain as an elect nation, and the British Empire as having a divine purpose. For the decades that witnessed revolutionary and Napoleonic wars in Europe, these decades also saw the immense expansion of the British Empire in the East, especially as Britain gained a tenuous control over much of the Indian subcontinent. Latterly, indeed, observed the evangelical East India Company chaplain Claudius Buchanan in 1809, latterly, indeed, it should seem as if God had selected this nation, as formerly his chosen people Israel, to preserve among men a knowledge of true religion. Amidst the ruin or infidelity of other nations, he added, Britain emerged as God's great missionary nation. In the course of Providence, noted the Evangelical magazine in 1813, Britain is become mistress of the East and possesses facilities for the purpose of propagating the gospel beyond any other nation. Overseas missions. Alongside the religious awakening among the population at home, there was a new zeal for overseas missions. The same imperatives that drove men and women to preach the gospel to the laboring poor in barns, cottages, and open fields, also called some to seek to bring Christianity to the peoples of India, Africa, or the Pacific Islands. And from the 1790s, again the 1790s, there were new initiatives bringing a major expansion of British Protestant overseas missions. In 1792, the Baptist Missionary Society was formed, followed by the London Missionary Society in 1795, the Glasgow Missionary Society and the Edinburgh Missionary Society in 1796, the Church Missionary Society in 1799, and the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society by 1818. At the inaugural meeting of the non-denominational London Missionary Society, David Bogue proclaimed that, quote, "This year will, I hope, form an epoch in the history of the world, for it was," he added, "a new Pentecost." Now, the early missionary endeavors in the field, to be sure, were often disappointing, and there were difficulties in recruiting missionaries. But the discourse of an awakened Britain with a providential mission, this discourse was inspiring. In 1804, dissenting and church evangelicals founded the British and Foreign Bible Society in London and rapidly established branch societies across Britain and Europe. Its aim, reflecting ecumenical and millenarian visions, was both simple and grandiose: to provide every inhabitant of the globe with access to a Bible without note or comment and translated into their own language. This, it was believed, would hasten the evangelization of the world and the return of Christ in glory. The older missionary societies within the Church of England, the Society for Propagating the Gospel in Foreign Parts, and the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, gradually experienced increased public interest and commitment as well. And British society became permeated by local branches of the national missionary societies. The missionary societies developed networks through overlapping memberships and interlocking directorates with a host of charitable and home missionary societies. The early missionaries that were sent out to the wider world by these societies came mainly from the lower middle or artisan classes. They were similar in social background to the itinerant village preachers who were spreading a simple gospel message at home, a background that could give them empathy for the colonized in the mission fields. The first Baptist missionary to India, William Carey, had been a cobbler. The early London Missionary Society missionary John Phillip had been a weaver in the Scottish borough of Kirkcaldy. He was converted by evangelical dissenters and sent to South Africa in 1819. The injustices he had experienced as an artisan in Scotland gave him a particular empathy for Africans and an abhorrence of racism and slavery. He played a key role in convincing the Cape government to issue the Ordinance of 1828, granting Africans in the Cape equal rights with British settlers. The prominent Scottish London Missionary Society missionary Robert Moffat had been a gardener before being sent to the Cape Colony. And another early LMS missionary, John Smith, had trained as a baker and was educated only in Sunday schools. Sent to Demerara, South Africa in 1817, he preached to the slaves, showing empathy for them, and he was unjustly sentenced to death and martyred by the colonial regime after the Demerara Rising of 1823. The missionary societies and the awakening movement contributed to the development of what recent historians have described as a philanthropic missionary public. This public consisted of the large numbers of women and men coming from the artisan, lower middle classes, and middle classes who joined their local branches of Bible and missionary societies, often connected with dissenting meeting houses, who attended missionary meetings, who read missionary magazines and pamphlets, who placed prints of missionaries on their walls, who collected missionary books, who made donations, often small amounts, a penny a week, to missionary causes, served as collectors of funds, joined in prayer circles and monthly prayer meetings for missions, hosted small meetings in their homes and collected signatures for petitions. They thrilled to stories of courage, adventure, and sacrifice in the mission fields. And later, the better-off members of this public might attend the annual May meetings of the missionary societies, the AGMs, in London's massive Exeter Hall, which was erected in 1831. These were the people affected by the awakening movement, and they combined support for overseas missions with support for the home mission of itinerant village preachers, cottage religion, and Sunday schools. It was all one movement. And through their public participation in the philanthropic missionary public, they grew in awareness of the wider world. This public combined zeal for missions with commitment to the anti-slavery movement. Many embraced millenarian beliefs, perceived of Britain as an elect nation and the British Empire as having a providential purpose. Shortly after his evangelical conversion in 1811, Thomas Chalmers formed a branch of the British and Foreign Bible Society in his rural Fife parish, and he became a fervent advocate of overseas missions and missionary societies, arguing that the shared commitment to missions enhanced the spiritual and moral growth of individuals at home and strengthened the communal and ecumenical aspects of the awakening. The philanthropic missionary public played a critical role, in two major achievements: the abolition of the slave trade and the opening of India to missionary activity. The anti-slavery abolition campaign in Britain began in 1787 and focused on ending the Atlantic slave trade. Dissenters took a prominent part in the movement, as did a circle of wealthy and influential evangelicals, mainly Anglicans, known as the Clapham sect, and including William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and Hannah More. This movement confronted powerful interests. Between 1662 and 1807, British ships carried some 3,400,000 Africans to slavery, or about half the slaves transported during that period. And for many, Britain's wealth and power were inextricably linked with slavery and the slave trade. Slavery was seen as fundamental to the whole institutional complex of the British state, including the religious establishments. Parliamentary motions in the 1790s met with continuing defeats. But outside Parliament, the emerging philanthropic missionary public gave increasing support to the movement, viewing slavery as a national sin and the end of slavery as vital for national redemption. They used pamphlets, broadsheets, poems, songs, and prints to impress on people the radical evils of the slave trade. 1792, 519 petitions bearing some 390,000 signatures were sent to Parliament in support of Wilberforce's motion to abolish the slave trade. At the time, this was the largest number of petitions sent to Parliament on a single issue. In 1791, the Baptist printer William Fox, with the support from influential Quakers, initiated a movement for the boycotting of slave-grown sugar. And within a year, an estimated 300,000 were refusing to use blood-stained sugar, as they called it, with women playing the key role in the consumers' boycott. And in 1807, after a struggle of some 20 years, Parliament abolished the British slave trade. And then several years later, following the fall of Napoleonic France, there was a public movement to demand that Britain exert its influence at the Congress of Vienna to convince the great powers to unite in ending the slave trade. In late June and July 1814, over 800 petitions bearing nearly 1 million signatures, about a tenth of the British population, were sent to Parliament in support of this policy. I believe the Foreign Secretary, Viscount Castlereagh, wrote, "There is hardly a village that has not met and petitioned." The powers meeting at Vienna did agree to work jointly to end the trade. It was an unprecedented show of public support. public opinion in support of a moral cause. And it's one, I would argue, was inconceivable apart from the religious awakening. Beginning in 1808, the United Kingdom began stationing warships off the coast of Africa, the West African Squadron, to intercept slave ships, leaving the slaves it freed in the British colony of Sierra Leone. And the missionary public also directed attention to India and the prospect of converting the peoples of Asia to Christianity. For many, Britain's rapid extension of dominion over most of the South Asian subcontinent, representing at the time about a fifth of the world's population and located thousands of miles away, this was inexplicable, or it was explicable only in providential terms. Much of this military conquest had taken place between 1793 and 1815, when British public attention was focused on the armed struggle with revolutionary and Napoleonic France in Europe. Our acquisition of power in India, insisted the Baptist preacher Robert Hall in 1813, quote, has been so rapid, so extensive, and so disproportionate to the limits of our native empire that there are few events in which the interposition of providence may be more distinctly traced. For many, this providential acquisition of India carried with it a religious responsibility. Before 1813, British missionary activity in India had been severely limited, restricted. The 18th century East India Company, the private trading company that governed India with support from the British state, had supported chaplains for its European officials, soldiers, and traders, and it quietly tolerated some limited missionary activity by its chaplains. But the company believed that in order to govern India so as to maximize profits, it must not interfere in the culture and religious beliefs of the peoples of India. But from the early 1790s, there were growing calls for the opening of India to Christian missions. And in the lead up to the renewal of the East India Company Charter by Parliament in 1813, the missionary public, in a campaign orchestrated by the Clapham Circle of Anglican evangelicals, and William Wilberforce, John Venn, campaigned vigorously for opening India to unrestricted missionary activity. Supporters of opening India to missions sent 895 petitions with nearly 500,000 signatures to Parliament. These came overwhelmingly from dissenters. Only 6 of the petitions came from Anglican sources. Significantly, there were also calls most forcibly expressed by the Anglican evangelical Claudius Buchanan for the formation of an established church in India. Calls which reflected the growing reform movement within the British established churches. And at the renewal of the charter in 1813, Parliament required the East India Company not only to open up India to Christian missionaries, but also to use company revenues to endow an established Anglican church for India, with a bishop in Calcutta and archdeacons in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. The East India Company in India continued to try to discourage missionary activity over the coming years, but by the 1820s, missionaries were arriving in significant numbers. They were insisting on their legal rights to be there, and they were making an impact, especially in education, following the arrival of Thomas Chalmers' student, the Scottish educational missionary Alexander Duff in Bengal in 1830. For many, it had become Britain's imperial mission to carry Christianity and civilization to India. Conclusion. The generation of 1790 to 1840 in Britain had, amid the upheavals of the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and early industrialization, experienced an unprecedented awakening of vital Christianity. Large numbers had found an emotive, heartfelt, personal Christian faith, often through itinerant village preaching, cottage religion, revival meetings. You found a sense of community, too, in cottage religion. Many chose to step outside the parish structures of the established church, leaving the parish church with all its historic and communal associations. Others had remained within the established churches, but they often expressed their religious commitments through voluntary associations, and they rejected older notions of state-sanctioned religious authority, including a close alliance of church and state. They emphasized their human agency for religious and moral action, intensifying what Professor Ward viewed as, quote, the long-felt need for private action in the world of religion. In prophecy and millenarian visions, many embraced a religion of feeling associated with Romanticism and a sense of an active providence in the world. They found faith that God was active not only in their lives, but was directing the world upheavals towards a higher purpose and a culmination. And in this, many felt a divine call to work for higher causes. The abolition of slavery, or the conversion of India and Asia, the world, that would involve them personally in the providential purpose. They became part of a philanthropic missionary public, believing that British wealth and power in the world brought special responsibility. The age of democratic revolutions brought a new dispensation for them, and also new possibilities. The world could be transformed, they believed. The world could be transformed. Slavery had always existed in the world, but now it could be ended. The awakening was, to a large extent, about empowering common women and men, recognizing the value and profound potential of each individual. And it reflected democratic aspirations. And to be sure, the larger dreams were not all realized, but a sense of individual agency, human agency, endured. Was this then the most important single generation in the modern history, not merely of English religion, but of the whole Christian world? As Professor Ward had said, it's a question that can't be answered really in an hour's lecture, but I think there is a case to be made in support of Professor Ward's bold and enduring claim.